All right. I just also wanted to say that I'm super excited to be here. I'm super excited that everybody else is here. I'm a super nerd, and I get goosebumps whenever we talk about just people coming together, bringing people back to the table. It's really some powerful stuff. So hopefully we all generated some really robust conversations while we were in our cafe tables. And I think in this portion now, hopefully we've generated a burning question that we would like to engage with our panelists on. So we're going to just kind of work through our tables, and we'll have each table give a question or a comment that will be directed towards the panelists, and we'll just...
So I'll try to summarize one of the quick or key points from our conversation and translate to a question. And one of the key points was that participatory budgeting is a tool, and it is one of many tools that are available to us. And as a tool, there is an opportunity to use it in new ways, new innovative ways, but there's also the potential to use it to reinforce existing structures. Whether that's who participates or how decisions are made. And so I suppose the question is that true with your experiences or any reflections on how to ensure that it does spur innovation and not just another way to reinforce the current structures?
Okay, that's a great question. I think, at least from the youth perspective, I think it's really important, I guess, getting a wide variety of different ideas, and because we haven't traditionally been involved as young people in the government, I think it's usually there are a lot of innovative ideas that come up. I think the danger is that young people sometimes aren't always aware of the technical constraints on projects. So I think making sure to keep the spirit of the ideas that they have true, rather than kind of funneling them or turning them into something different that might be more traditional, is an important part during the process.
I like how you mentioned it as being a tool. I see PB as being a tool of power, and with power is having the ability to act. So knowing when you're participating in PB processes, who are being the actors in the room, and who are you inviting to the table? Kind of what Jamal said earlier about, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's an important thing, because you can be eaten up by the agendas that people are trying to force when it comes to what they want out of certain processes. So understanding who's at the table and what impact are you having and what intent do you bring with that is really important to consider.
So just to echo something that Jess said, so I think this is crucial. It's thinking about the recruitment stage of participants. So if there's an open call for participants, is it possible for for an initial body to identify what types of individuals from different types of groups, is it possible to identify them at an initial point and then to actively go out and ensure that you have representation from those groups? So I think that's really sort of one of the key ways that you can sort of avoid this being dominated sort of either by the sort of the usual suspects, or that it just sort of becomes sort of a mouthpiece for the mayor's office or a city council member. So I think innovation is really sort of thinking about who can be there and then what can they do to make their use of their time something useful to help them build their communities.
And what I'd add to that from a implementer, practitioner standpoint is to be accountable and transparent. So that's everything from accountability and transparency within each of the programmatic phases. So say, we're at the end of voting and we clearly see which projects the people wanted, but for some reason it doesn't go through. It is important that we as practitioners maintain that level of responsiveness to the people who voted. Anything on the ballot should be able to be implemented. That's the standard that we hold in the city of Seattle. We will put nothing on the ballot that cannot be executed. Similarly, what does accountability look like in the other phases? It looks like communities of color developing metrics that we must be accountable to and hit. If we're not hitting these metrics, the onus is on us to analyze what we're doing and how we can align ourselves with what the city, what folks have told us that we should be doing.
So I think that's a really important question, innovation in participatory democracy, or participatory budgeting. But I think also is just remember to have fun with it, keep it engaging, keep it alive. And we also, have to think about outside the box too. What's beyond participatory budgeting, participatory democracy? There's participatory policy making, participatory criminal justice, all these different aspects of participatory democracy that you can really engage in and kind of go around to find new innovative ways to bring things in. So I think that's a really important.
The implication, it seems to me, is that participatory budgeting has the implication for redistributing power and resources to non-traditionally active or present communities, given access to that policy table or to that decision-making power. But that it also needs institutional support to really move the needle. So my question is, how might we implement something like participatory budgeting in a policy environment that's more conservative than Portland or Seattle, Gresham, for example, and get the support needed to create something that's actually an authentic vehicle to represent the interests of community members who are not typically given a seat at the table and not just given the trappings of a participatory institution that really just serves to perpetuate status quo interests? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really great question, and it really goes back to rhetoric and the language that we use can be very polarizing. On the face of it, participatory budgeting, participatory democracy is very bipartisan, right? And in Seattle, with such similar to Portland, it's kind of that like progressive hammer that kind of comes on the assumption that everybody's progressive. And what we're really talking about when we say participatory budgeting is there's also a lot of fiscal pragmatism within it as well. So what I would say is playing up and using the language of democracy serves everyone. Democracy doesn't just serve Democrats. Engaged citizens lead to exponential amounts of overall good for us, right? And then the other piece of it is, and to play back on that, play up the fiscal conservatism, is we all need to learn good financial practices. That's very bipartisan. So that when you are pitching it in an environment where it's, there's one way to talk about participatory democracy as very progressive and giving power to the people, or you can frame it as this is really teaching people to take ownership over our finances. And that also looks like how do you curb, we're talking about values, right? Like curbing spending in one to another. This is the discourse that you have the power to change if you feel like, hey, maybe children don't need that many playgrounds. Okay, that's a very extreme example, but I'm saying that there's a possibility to talk about resources within a less, this is progressive, this is conservative, as much as this is for all of us.
All right, so we had a plethora of questions, so I guess we'll stick with one. But when we were talking about our concerns and different ideas, the issue of equity just continued to pop up through our discussion. And initially, our very first question was, how do you get people to the table that really need to be there? I know that we've talked about it a little bit, but just looking at some of the results that were shown through the presentations, it's clear that there's still an issue of getting certain types of people or demographics to be able to participate. So I feel like that's a very large, maybe loaded question, but just some ideas and thoughts on how we can really, truly make it equitable for everybody.
So I think there's two basic ways. One of the ones is that I mentioned earlier, and that's around the issue of recruitment, sort of identifying the groups and sort of making it's a really time-intensive, based on interpersonal relationships, where you try to draw people in. The second way is through program design. And through program design, you can do it in there's a couple different ways within program design. One way is to create a set of rules that ensures more resources go to underserviced neighborhoods. A second area is that a program could focus on a policy area that is a fundamental concern. So, for example, just drawing from Seoul, South Korea, they focused on public security, And one of the major issues is that poor neighborhoods were trying to get in sort of cameras to help aid the police, right? So you can sort of, in high areas of crime. So I think it then becomes sort of, as an equity issue, you can begin to put in rule features that say, okay, these are thematically a big issue that are of more concern, and so therefore the rules will be specifically geared towards that. One of the biggest problems, I think, is in sort of going back to this equity issue, is it's really hard, I think, to set up institutions where you say more resources are going to go on a per capita basis to underserved neighborhoods. Because those neighborhoods that aren't underserved are going to get upset. And so there's going to be a lot of conflict and pushback. So I think that's one of the key areas. So that's sort of this trying to sort of set up a dialogue around it could be around a thematic issue where you sidestep it. You say, okay, public security tends to be just fine in Northwest Portland, but it's less so in Northeast or North Portland. And so we're going to focus on public security as an issue.
Thanks. So we were the Spanish group. I feel like we focused on the Hispanic community. And out of all the questions we have, the one that is burning in my mind is there's a lot of mistrust from our communities to the government, whether it speaks of where we grew up or our current political climate. So do you have any suggestions on how we could build more trust in the process from our communities to what we're trying to achieve?
This is going to be an unsatisfying response, but what I'm going to say is it has to come from trusted voices, right? Like you guys are the leaders, right? And I'll say this from my own experience of being a first-generation Vietnamese woman, is if someone who is coming to speak to me from an outside perspective that doesn't know the Vietnamese community about what we should do, I'm going to be immediately very walls up. But I think that there's so much people power within the Latino communities that y'all the leaders, y'all know the answers, and it's actually on the onus of the status quo and the government to create space, and that's on us to create that, right? But I don't think that anybody should tell communities of color what the solutions are, because I think communities of color have the answer. That's a great question. And so this is kind of what I wanted to, I didn't go enough into the presentation. The question of why Youth Voice, Youth Choice transformed into Your Voice, Your Choice was, we started as $700,000 because it was a pilot that a former council member was really passionate and championed with our former mayor. And after that year, there was no more money. It was one-time spending. But we knew as a city that we didn't want to give up on participatory budgeting, which means we had to be creative. So we created Your Voice, Your Choice in part because there was an existing program called the Neighborhood Parks and Street Fund, which for decades had been already money earmarked for park and street improvements within neighborhoods. Now, we took that program and that earmarked capital funding and added the participatory budgeting framework on it because, frankly, we needed to be creative. And it's a very pragmatic move, and I say that when you are in a government place and there was no way that the city council was going to give us more money for something, create new buckets of money, look at where there's already money and try to apply this process upon it. And I guarantee, especially the way that our cities and our counties are structured, capital funding is one of those secured buckets of funding that always can work. The difficulty with human services and like unrestricted dollars in the general fund is it's harder to make the case to politicians to invest make investments that are one time rather than a sustainable, what is the return?
If I can just add on really quick, I think sort of thinking about this is there's an efficiency argument. You can make the argument that resources are going to be spent more efficiently because they're more tied in to what individuals really want. So it's moving beyond sort of what elected officials and city administrators think is necessary, and sort of making a better use of it. The second one is a legitimacy issue. And this is where you begin to see governments doing this in times of crisis because they can legitimize shifting money around on the basis of the number of people who come and their forms of engagement. Just to give you one brief example, there's a case in Lincoln, Nebraska. They didn't call it participatory budgeting, but it was very similar. And basically, they were facing a budget crisis. They got a cross-section of the population together to ask them where to cut and how to cut resources, which is a terrible thing to ask citizens to do. But one of the things they did is they came up with this process of here's what we think the priorities are. And then they actually said, but what we think you should do is we should do a short-term tax increase. And then this citizen body actually put pressure on the city council to make it happen. So it was a way of sort of a sidestepping. It wasn't what they were, it wasn't what the creators thought it was going to happen, but it's what it ended up coming out of the process.
So our group wondered what kind of tools and what kind of messages you suggest for working with leaders to reduce the amount of resistance or concern that they have. How do you mitigate the risk that they feel in sort of turning over these kinds of decisions to folks that are not elected?
Well, I think it starts with representation because the way they got there was through us, basically. So it's their job to kind of listen to their constituency. And also, they have the task of carrying that out. So understanding what role do they have as an official to kind of sidestep the opinions of their constituency, but also understanding the demands. So I think that's something that is a balancing act for both parties concerning what is the official's role, but what can the constituency provide in terms of communication. And I think that's key in terms of kind of relaying like a strong relationship between a constituent and their elected official.
And I'm going to quickly add, Bernie, it might be a matter of framing that this is a partnership. There's not sort of, I have more power than you do now, but we're sharing it in a truly egalitarian way. So,
question that kind of rose to the top that hasn't particularly been asked yet at this table was, how do you measure success?
So I'll start. So that's a great question. I think for the Youth Participatory Budgeting Program, it was really about how many young people first we were able to get involved and from what districts, from what communities they were, taking into account the information of what school districts they were a part of, whether they shared their ideas initially and or whether they were actually engaged throughout the whole process and ended up voting, and also the diversity of projects that we were able to produce. Were these projects all serving one neighborhood, or were they going to a variety of places and for a variety of causes that were in need? So yeah, those were the main factors, I would say.
I want to jump in here because this question is a great question. It's at the fundamental heart of both the academic and policy debates. Like the question, the way that I sort of reframe it a little bit is, do these programs matter? Is it worthwhile? And that sort of gets us into, is it worthwhile people spending their time on these programs? And then, so I think one of the ways you could approach this is to start with the so what question around each program. And what is that program trying to accomplish? Is it trying to build community? Is it trying to improve governance? Is it trying to help clean up city finances? Trying to reduce corruption? So those are some of the ways that once you have the so what question, the success metrics come out of that. And it can be around, could be around, citizen learning and empowerment. It could also be sort of if resources are begin to be allocated in different ways. So for example, it may be that if Paris is spending so much money, what were the goals of their organization as when they launched it? What were they trying to accomplish? Was it making the city better for tourists? Was it for their residents? Was it for school children? And then trying to sort of follow that through. So one of the reasons that we use that sort of back in my own research where we're using this metric of infant mortality is because infant mortality is really sort of about the access of poor and low-income women to healthcare. And it really demonstrates sort of how a city responds and begins to think about access for particular groups of women and families to the medical system. So that was a way to sort of show, were they reaching their goals of this inversion of priorities of trying to allocate money into communities that historically been underserved. I think it really comes down to sort of asking the so what, or sort of responding to the so what question.
So this is sort of it's a process question about how you set up an effective system. So how do we create an effective participatory budgeting process that takes into account the fragmented systems of government that we have? And I think those exist everywhere, but particularly here in Portland. I mean, we've got a city and a county, state government, school districts, Metro, TriMet, all of which are providing different services. And services that I could imagine in a PB process, citizens don't understand those distinctions necessarily and are going to be asking for different things. I'd love to say that 6 governments could come together and run a process, but I know that's not going to happen. Yeah. So in your experience, how do you deal with that fragmentation when you're going through this process and keep that trust with the community members who are participating?
Yeah, that is the golden question, and I also want to say that I've had a few conversations already about how you negotiate multiple scales of government and jurisdiction. The city of Seattle has not tackled that. For your Voice Your Choice, we work with 2 departments, Seattle Parks and Recreation, Seattle Department of Transportation. I wish I could say that it was easy. You'd think so internally with just a few departments. It's complicated. Our county is trying to start a participatory budgeting program as well. They're running into some walls. So there's 2 parts in that. There's the internal and the external. So externally, as you can imagine, when we're out in communities and we're soliciting ideas and doing projects, the metro comes up quite often, bus shelters. Well, technically that's actually county, that falls outside of us, so that doesn't work. So we have to say no a lot to many ideas. But rather than seeing it as a no, it's actually a teaching opportunity to talk about scales of government. So it's one of those like, wait, I don't understand, you don't handle the metro? No, we handle the streets, right? And that's a part of the educational opportunities that emerge when you're out, right? And then take the internal coordination of it. Sorry, so the question is what advice in terms of process? What I would say is relationships. You definitely need strong relationships to make this work. And it won't work if you don't have strong relationships. And a part of that too is a lot of it is going to be timing. Who is in power, who is in their jobs, and that continuity. And what I'd say is a clear delineation of roles and a clear communication and goals. We know you can sit down and map out all of the barriers that exist, and as you're doing your program design, put those barriers in the forefront. And I say this a lot, I say it's not to say have low expectations, but have reasonable expectations. Draw a smaller box, do that box really well, execute to the full point, then use that data as a case to then expand. But don't shoot for the moon right off the bat. That's setting yourself up to fail, and it's defeating. It's defeating for your staff. It's defeating for electeds. It's about calling where you can wins and using it as fuel.
Thank you.
What I'd say is that we have to continue to do better on that. Our engagement strategies changed by tapping community-based organizations that are the trusted partners and folks that can mobilize people. I think first and foremost, recognizing that the city is a government entity with limitations, that we need to have the folks that are actually doing the work as the center of it. So what that means is putting a lot of power and trust within our nonprofit service providers and community-based organizations to drive that work, and then driving our engagement and outreach strategy while supporting them also. But the resource wars is real, and especially within districts, and the disproportionate resources that happen across neighborhoods. And what we do in our project development, which are the 2-hour meetings, is we actually have criteria that center on need at location, and also looking at what are the environment. We actually make people look at those maps, look at collision data, and actually think about when you're evaluating who is being affected by this project. So what are the cultural institutions around there? What communities are there? And we ask them to score and evaluate the projects based off of a criteria equity. Now, does that work all the time? No, people are in their own discretion, but we set up the conversation to put that as the center of criteria.
What would be the appropriate way to introduce participatory budgeting to the Portland Public Schools?
That sounds like an awesome idea. I think it's a great way to go through schools. That's probably the most direct way to reach young people. And I would say just making sure to have young people on your commission, because they are the ones who know the kind of the best access points. Like, for example, like at what time of day to like run meetings in which students come up with the ideas for how to use the money. So I think really making it a partnership between student leaders. You could have an application for that, and the city officials.
I would also say focusing on the communities at the school that need it the most. Amy brought up like a great like data picture of like the different pockets that weren't being like historically served. So understanding if, I'm not sure how the Portland public school system works, if students can like go to schools that are outside of their neighborhood, but like understanding the communities that are at the school and those who haven't been historically listened to, it's important to get those voices instead of hearing from the ones that have already been heard. So that's key in kind of fueling the education in the Portland Public School District.
All right, so let's hear it for our panelists here. Thank you, everybody.